As I walked into the lawyer's office, my husband's face went from smug to shocked in seconds. 6 months ago, while I was battling stage 3 breast cancer, he left me for his dental hygienist, saying my illness was too much to handle. Today, as the sole owner of our family business and properties, I was about to serve him divorce papers that would leave him with nothing but the clothes on his back. The woman who handed him the documents was his pregnant girlfriend who had replaced me in his life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The conference room of Miller & Associates law firm gleamed under soft recessed lighting, the polished cherry table reflecting the faces of anxious participants. I adjusted my tailored navy pantsuit, selected carefully for this moment, and felt the weight of the leather portfolio in my hands. Inside contained divorce papers that would sever not just our marriage, but all of Robert's connections to the businesses and properties he mistakenly believed he controlled. Mrs. Sarah Morgan, represented by Miller & Associates, announced. Jessica, the stern-faced legal assistant who had been instrumental in making this day possible. The room fell silent. Most had expected just another mundane divorce proceeding. Not this. I could feel the collective shift in energy as I moved toward the head of the table, the position my soon-to-be ex-husband Robert had occupied for every business meeting throughout our 15-year marriage. Robert sat halfway down the table, his designer watch catching the light as he leaned forward. His expression morphed from mild curiosity to recognition, then to barely concealed panic. Beside him, Brittany Wilson, once my dental hygienist, now 6 months pregnant with his child, looked between us in confusion, still not comprehending the situation. "Thank you all for gathering today," I began, my voice steady and clear, a voice I had practiced during those long nights of chemotherapy when sleep wouldn't come. As of 9 a.m. this morning, Morgan Family Holdings has completed restructuring its ownership, and all associated properties and businesses have been transferred according to the terms of our original partnership agreement. The tension was palpable. Robert had been expecting a standard divorce negotiation, promises of split assets, perhaps a fight over the house in Denver and our vacation cabin in Aspen. What he didn't know was that Morgan Family Restaurants, the chain of 5 successful farm-to-table establishments we had built from nothing in the 10 years of our marriage, was now solely in my name, along with all 3 properties. Some of you may remember that I was the original investor in our first restaurant, I continued, allowing my gaze to sweep the room before settling on Robert. For those who don't, I provided the initial $200,000 capital from my inheritance to open the garden table when Robert was still a line cook with a dream. Robert's knuckles whitened around his Mont Blanc pen, a 5th anniversary gift from me. The memory of his words echoed between us across the polished table. "You're dead weight now, Sarah. The restaurants need someone vibrant, healthy. Cancer. Patients aren't exactly good for business." I opened my portfolio, the familiar action grounding me in the present. Morgan Family Holdings has seen declining profits over the past 6 months, customer satisfaction at an all-time low, and employee retention dropping by 34% annually. Several of Robert's buddies, installed as managers after my diagnosis, shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting to Robert, whose face had taken on a reddish hue. He had built his takeover on creating the appearance of success while the foundation crumbled. A strategy I had warned him about before my diagnosis when he first proposed rapid expansion. "Immediate restructuring is necessary," I said, nodding to Jessica, who began distributing sealed envelopes. 5 management positions are being eliminated effective immediately. The room erupted in murmurs as Robert's friends reached for the envelopes with trembling hands. Some would find standard meeting agendas, 5 would find termination agreements. Robert didn't move to touch his envelope, already understanding its contents. Brittany reached for hers with manicured fingers, the 2-carat diamond on her left hand, so similar to the one Robert had once given me, catching the light. "This is absurd," Robert finally spoke, his voice tight with controlled rage. "You can't just walk in here and—" "The corporate bylaws and partnership agreement approved this restructuring plan this morning," I interrupted smoothly. "Your performance reviews and financial discrepancies over the past year provided all the evidence needed. 6 months ago, I couldn't have imagined being in this position. The night Robert told me he was leaving, 4 days after my second round of chemotherapy, when my hair had just begun falling out, I had collapsed on our bathroom floor, sobbing as he methodically packed his toiletries. 'You've always been too emotional for business, Sarah,' he had said, not even looking at me as he selected which colognes to take. 'Brittany understands what it takes to keep things running when times get tough. You never will.' That night had broken me, but as I stood now at the head of the conference table, I recognized it had also rebuilt me into someone stronger, more strategic, and far more dangerous than the woman Robert had dismissed. Those affected will be escorted to collect personal belongings," I continued, gesturing toward the door where security personnel now stood. "Severance details are outlined in your packets, contingent upon standard non-disclosure agreements." Robert pushed back his chair abruptly, standing to his full height. "This is personal, not business," he hissed, loud enough for nearby attorneys to hear. "You've orchestrated this whole thing for revenge." I met his gaze steadily, feeling nothing but cool detachment where pain had once lived. "On the contrary, Robert, the corporate board who voted unanimously this morning has never met me personally. They voted based on performance data and my proposed recovery strategy." I allowed a small smile. "Though I won't deny this particular aspect of the restructuring brings additional satisfaction." Brittany had finally opened her envelope, her face draining of color as she read its contents. Unlike Robert, she hadn't been terminated, a deliberate choice on my part. Her skills as a dental hygienist had never been the issue, only her ethics. "Ms. Wilson will be offered a position at the Denver Smile Center effective next week," I announced, watching as she processed this information. The Smile Center was the dental practice I had secretly purchased last month, about 500 miles away from our flagship restaurant in Portland. The memory of discovering their affair surfaced briefly. Walking into Robert's office after my doctor's appointment, still processing the cancer diagnosis, only to find him with Brittany on the desk I had helped select when we opened our first restaurant. The humiliation had been excruciating, compounded when he called me the next day to discuss the situation and inform me my services were no longer required at the restaurants during my treatment. "You're a skilled businesswoman, Sarah," he had said with practiced sympathy, "but the restaurant industry requires a certain energy and presence you can't provide right now." As security approached Robert, whose face now fluctuated between rage and disbelief, I felt a strange sense of calm. The energy and presence he claimed I lacked had been channeled into planning this moment while undergoing treatment, researching legal options between radiation sessions, and signing papers from my hospital bed. "This meeting will reconvene at 3 in Tower," I said to the remaining attorneys and financial advisors, many of whom were studiously avoiding eye contact with either me or Robert. "We'll discuss the transition plan and new direction for Morgan Family Holdings. Those remaining should consider this an opportunity to realign with the company's original vision." Robert was being escorted toward the door, his normally confident stride faltering. He paused as he passed me. "You won't be able to run these restaurants," he said quietly, a final attempt to shake my confidence. "The cancer will come back. You'll destroy everything I've built." I leaned closer, my voice for his ears only. "I'm not going to run your restaurants, Robert. I'm going to rebuild my company." As the door closed behind him, I took the seat at the head of the table. Not Robert's seat, but the one that had always been intended for a visionary leader. The remaining participants watched me with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and dawning respect. The journey that had led me from sobbing on my bathroom floor to commandeering this conference room had been anything but easy. After Robert had pushed me out of our restaurants, I'd found myself battling cancer alone at 42, with a broken heart and a shattered professional identity. But that morning in the conference room was just the beginning.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Robert didn't yet know what awaited him outside. Reporters tipped off about financial irregularities at the restaurants, his carefully cultivated reputation already unraveling as local food critics caught wind of the dramatic leadership change. The Morgan Wilson residence sat perched on a hillside overlooking downtown Portland, its contemporary cedar and glass facade a testament to the success of Morgan family restaurants. The house had been featured in Portland Monthly just months earlier. Culinary power couple creates modern Northwest haven. A glossy spread showcasing the custom features Robert and I had meticulously selected together. The night that Robert ended our marriage, rain pelted against the floor-to-ceiling windows of our master bedroom. The city skyline blurred behind sheets of water. The weather seemed determined to match my internal landscape, turbulent, obscured, drowning. "I don't understand," I had repeated, watching Robert methodically pack his toiletries into a leather DOP kit, a 4th anniversary gift I had given him. "We just got the diagnosis yesterday. We were planning to fight this together." Robert barely looked up as he arranged his grooming products with practiced precision. "I've been meaning to have this conversation for months, Sarah. There's never a good time." The bedroom that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed cavernous and cold. Minimalist furniture that had appeared elegant in daylight now felt sterile under the recessed lighting. The king-sized bed, with its organic cotton linens, untouched that evening, looked like a vast empty field between us. "Is this about the new restaurant location?" I asked, my mind racing to make sense of this sudden upheaval while still processing the words Stage 3 from yesterday's doctor visit. "I know we had different opinions about expanding to Seattle, but we've always worked through strategic differences." Robert sighed, the sound heavy with practiced patience. He finally turned to face me, his expression a careful mask of regret that didn't quite reach his eyes. "This isn't about any single disagreement, Sarah. It's about fundamental incompatibility, both personally and professionally." He closed the DOP kit with a definitive click. "I need a partner who understands what it takes to succeed at this level. Someone who can make the tough calls without getting emotional. And now, with your diagnosis." The carefully controlled words landed like precise incisions. This wasn't an impulsive decision. This was a planned extraction, surgical and cold. "You're talking about Brittany," I said, the realization crystallizing. With nauseating clarity, the lingering meetings, the changed passwords to our business accounts, the subtle exclusions from key discussions over the past months, all suddenly making a terrible kind of sense. Robert didn't deny it. "Brittany understands my vision for the restaurants. She supports my decisions instead of constantly challenging them. That's my job as your business partner and your wife," I countered, my voice rising despite my efforts. "To maintain composure, to challenge you when you're making decisions that could harm what we've built, the aggressive expansion strategy you're pushing. It's creating unsustainable debt. You know I'm right about this." A flash of irritation crossed Robert's face, breaking through his composed facade. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're too cautious, Too concerned with employee satisfaction and sustainability when we need to be focused on growth at all costs. He picked up his suitcase, glancing around the room one final time. I've already spoken with our lawyers. We've agreed it's best if you step back from restaurant operations while you focus on your health issues. The room seemed to tilt around me. You've spoken with the lawyers without me. I'm the co-owner with equal stake in everything we've built. A position you're in no condition to fulfill, Robert said coldly. You'll be compensated, of course. The terms are fair. Fair? The word came out as barely a whisper. Robert paused in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the hallway light. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of genuine regret cross his face. You're a brilliant woman, Sarah, but the restaurant business requires a certain vigor you simply can't provide right now. Then he was gone, footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving me standing in the center of our meticulously designed bedroom, the sound of rain against glass, the only response to my unraveling world. I didn't move for hours, standing frozen as if motion might confirm that this new reality was permanent. Outside, the Portland skyline emerged gradually as the storm cleared, lights twinkling against the night sky. The city looked the same, impossibly unchanged, while everything inside had been destroyed. The home that had been featured in magazines now felt like an elaborate stage set, beautiful but hollow, designed for a life that no longer existed. Every carefully selected piece of furniture, every thoughtfully chosen artwork, suddenly seemed to belong to different people, characters in a story that had unexpectedly ended. The walk-in closet Robert had just emptied had been designed with dual sides, his and hers, with a center island of drawers we shared. Now his absence created a physical void that echoed the emotional one, tearing through my chest. His cologne lingered in the air, the scent both comforting and nauseating in its familiarity. The night stretched endlessly as I finally moved from standing to sitting on the edge of the bed, my body folding in on itself as the magnitude of the loss engulfed me. Not just my marriage, but my business, my professional identity, and my partner in facing cancer. All excised in one clinical conversation. By morning, when the first rays of sunlight broke through the automated blinds programmed by Robert to rise at precisely 6:15 a.m., I had not slept. My eyes, swollen from crying, looked out at the city spread below, a city where somewhere Robert and Brittany were beginning their new life amid the ruins of mine. The house, designed to showcase our success, now felt like a mausoleum for my dreams. Every corner held memories of plans made, celebrations shared, a future mapped out in confident detail. The kitchen where we had hosted dinner parties for restaurant investors, the dining room where we had signed our first major supplier contract, the terrace where we'd toasted each restaurant opening. I moved through these spaces like a ghost, touching surfaces, remembering. The pain was physical, a constrictive pressure in my chest, a hollow in my stomach, a persistent trembling in my hands that wouldn't subside no matter how tightly I clasped them. When my phone rang at precisely 9 a.m., Robert's name appearing. On the screen, I almost didn't answer. But some remaining professional instinct, some deeply ingrained sense of responsibility to the business we'd built, compelled me to accept the call. "I'm glad you picked up," Robert said, his voice brisk, already shifted into full business mode. "I've scheduled a meeting with our lawyers at 11 to discuss your transition package. It would be best if you came to the downtown office one last time to sign the paperwork." I listened, my free hand gripping the kitchen counter so hard my knuckles whitened. Through the phone, I could hear the familiar sounds of our flagship restaurant, gentle conversation, the espresso machine in the break room, phones ringing, life continuing as normal in the business I had helped create. "Sarah, are you there?" Robert's impatience leaked through. "Yes," I managed, the single word an accomplishment against the tightness in my throat. Good. 11 a.m. then. Brittany will send you the details of what to bring. We'll need your restaurant access cards and company laptop. The casual mention of Brittany, now apparently handling the logistics of my professional execution, sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. The woman who had replaced me in Robert's bed was now facilitating my removal from the company I had co-founded. "I'll be there," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. After hanging up, I moved to the master bathroom, a sanctuary of marble and glass I had designed myself. The woman in the mirror was unrecognizable, pale, hollow-eyed, diminished. For a moment, I simply stared at this stranger, this shell of the confident entrepreneur who had graced magazine covers alongside Robert as Portland's most dynamic culinary power couple. Then, with hands that trembled slightly less than before, I reached for my makeup bag. If I was to be executed professionally, I would not go without dignity. I would face Robert, Brittany, and the legal team as Sarah Morgan, co-founder of Morgan Family Restaurants, not as the shattered woman who had stood immobile in her bedroom all night. Layer by layer, I rebuilt my exterior. Foundation, concealer, subtle contour, a sweep of blush to bring life back to my pallor. The familiar ritual was anchoring, each product a small step toward reclaiming some semblance of control. By the time I selected a crisp white blouse and charcoal pencil skirt from my closet, something had shifted imperceptibly within me. The pain remained raw and overwhelming, but alongside it, something else had begun to take root. Not hope, but perhaps its prerequisite, a determination to survive this moment and the next and the one after that. The house, with its soaring ceilings and perfect views, had been designed to impress, to announce to the world that Sarah and Robert Morgan had arrived. Now, as I gathered my car keys and professional portfolio, I recognized it for what it truly was, a beautiful empty shell that had never been a home. As I stepped through the front door toward my waiting car, I didn't know yet what would rise from the ashes of this devastation. I couldn't imagine that 6 months later I would stand at the head of a conference room table, watching Robert's face contort with shock as I reclaimed what he had taken. I knew only that I had to survive this day, and I would, with my head held high and my wounds carefully concealed behind a mask of professional composure. Downtown Portland gleamed in the morning sunlight as I drove toward our flagship restaurant's offices one last time, unaware that this ending was actually the first step in a remarkable beginning. The Morgan Family Restaurant's headquarters occupied the top floor of a renovated brick building in Portland's trendy Pearl District. I remembered every detail of its renovation. The heated debates over the floor plan design, the careful selection of the building location, even the custom-made reception desk that greeted visitors with its sleek curves of reclaimed Douglas fir. As I stepped off the elevator at precisely 10:45 that morning, I felt like a ghost in my own creation. Employees glanced up as I passed, their expressions shifting quickly from recognition to discomfort before they looked away. News traveled fast in restaurant environments, and it was clear from their averted eyes that everyone already knew. "Good morning, Mrs. Morgan," said Michael, the security guard who had worked at our flagship location since its opening day. His usual warm smile was replaced with a look of awkward sympathy. "It's good to see you." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. I had known these halls would feel different today, but I hadn't anticipated the acute sense of alienation, of suddenly being an outsider in the very space I had helped design. The receptionist, a recent hire I didn't recognize, looked up with a professionally neutral expression. "Ms. Morgan, the legal team is expecting you. Conference room B." Not the main conference room where we had held countless strategy sessions, but the smaller, windowless space typically used for vendor meetings. The message was clear. This was to be as quick and clinical as possible. "Thank you," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. The walk to conference room B felt interminable. Two chefs from the test kitchen joined me in the hallway, their animated conversation about a new menu dropping into uncomfortable silence when they recognized me. I kept my eyes fixed forward, my reflection in the polished copper wall sconces showing a woman composed and professional, the careful mask betraying none of the turmoil beneath. Conference room B was exactly as I remembered. Utilitarian and bland, with generic motivational posters that had been selected by a consultant years ago. Waiting inside were Patricia Winters from Legal, a man I didn't recognize who was clearly an attorney, and Brittany Wilson. Brittany sat with perfect posture in a dress I recognized from our restaurant's last holiday party. The irony wasn't lost. On me, while I had been home hosting staff and their families, Brittany had already been more than Robert's dental hygienist. "Sarah, thank you for coming in," Patricia began, her professional tone barely concealing her discomfort. "This is Marcus Bennett from Wilson & Associates." I took the seat across from them, placing my portfolio carefully on the table. "Where's Robert?" "Mr. Morgan thought it would be best if he wasn't present for this discussion," Brittany answered, smoothly. "He wanted to ensure the transition was handled with appropriate sensitivity. The audacity of his absence, of sending his mistress instead, struck me with such force that I nearly laughed. This, then, was the final indignity, being processed out of my own company by the woman who had replaced me while Robert couldn't even face me. "I see," I said, the two simple words containing volumes. Marcus Bennett cleared his throat, sliding a thick document across the table. "We've prepared a comprehensive separation package that I believe you'll find quite generous." I didn't reach for it immediately. "Before we begin, I'd like to understand exactly what the staff has been told about my departure." Patricia and Marcus exchanged glances. Brittany's expression remained perfectly controlled. "The official communication states that you're stepping back to focus on your health," Patricia offered. "Robert was quite insistent that your contribution to the restaurants be acknowledged appropriately." "How thoughtful of him," I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. I finally reached for the document, opening it to scan the first page. The language was dense with legal terminology, but the essence was clear. In exchange for my shares being bought at a predetermined rate and a substantial severance package, I would relinquish all claims to Morgan Family Restaurants and sign a comprehensive non-competition agreement. The non-compete covers all restaurant management and culinary consulting in the Pacific Northwest for a period of 3 years, Marcus explained, pointing to the relevant section. 3 years. Robert wasn't just removing me from our restaurants, he was effectively barring me from working in my field in our region for 3 years. The calculated ruthlessness of it took my breath away. "And if I don't sign?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Marcus's expression tightened slightly. "Mr. Morgan hoped it wouldn't come to that, but should you choose not to accept these terms, the company is prepared to proceed with a performance-based termination." "Performance-based?" I repeated, the words tasting bitter. Brittany leaned forward slightly. "There's documentation of several instances where your cautious approach caused Morgan restaurants to miss key growth opportunities. The corporate attorneys have reviewed these cases." Of course they had. Robert had been systematically building his case, likely for months. The disagreements that I had thought were normal strategic debates between partners had been carefully documented and presented as failures on my part. I'd looked at Brittany directly for the first time, taking in the woman who had been my dental hygienist for the past 2 years. She was younger, certainly, but it wasn't just youth that Robert had chosen. It was compliance. Where I challenged, Brittany supported. Where I urged caution, Brittany encouraged risk. She was everything I wasn't. And at this moment, that included being on the winning side of this corporate coup. "I'd like a moment to review the document in private," I said, my voice remarkably steady. "Of course," Patricia replied, looking relieved at the prospect of a brief escape from the tension. "We'll be just outside when you're ready." As the door closed behind them, I finally allowed my carefully maintained expression to crumble. The conference room that had felt small before now seemed to be closing in around me. I had helped build Morgan Family Restaurants from an idea to a company valued at over 15 million. And now I was being erased, efficiently, legally, completely. I flipped through the agreement, skimming the sections detailing what I would receive and what I would give up. The financial terms were indeed generous, as Marcus had said. Robert was buying my silence and my absence at a premium price. A knock at the door startled me. Instead of Patricia or the others, it was Lisa Chen, our director of operations, and one of the few executives I had personally hired years ago. "I heard you were here," Lisa said, closing the door quickly behind her. "I don't have much time." "They've got me in the box, signing my execution papers," I said, attempting a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Lisa didn't return it. "Listen to me. Don't sign anything yet. Robert's been planning this for months. He's been systematically discrediting your contributions in management meetings, revising the narrative to minimize your role." "I suspected as much," I replied, a cold clarity beginning to replace the emotional fog I'd been in since last night. "It's worse than you think," Lisa continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's moving the restaurants in a completely new direction. Massive, leveraging for rapid expansion. The conservative approach you've advocated, he's doing the exact opposite. He's gambling everything on aggressive growth." I felt a flicker of vindication. I'd been warning about the dangers of over-leveraging for months, concerns Robert had dismissed as overly cautious. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Lisa glanced nervously at the door. "Because it's wrong, what he's doing, not just to you personally, but to the company. And because," she hesitated, "because I'm leaving too. I gave my notice this morning. Several of us are." The realization that I wasn't alone in my concerns about Robert's leadership provided an unexpected spark of strength. If others could see it too, if Lisa, one of our most valuable executives, was walking away, perhaps my judgment hadn't been as clouded by emotion as Robert had claimed. "Thank you," I said, reaching out to squeeze Lisa's hand. "This means more than you know." "Just be careful," Lisa warned, moving toward the door. "Robert's not the man we thought he was. And Brittany," she shook her head, "she's ambitious, very ambitious." As Lisa slipped out, I returned my attention to the agreement before me. The parameters of my challenge were now clear. Robert had orchestrated not just the end of our marriage, but the systematic dismantling of my professional reputation. He had rewritten our shared history to position himself as the visionary and me as the liability. And he had selected in Brittany someone who would reinforce rather than challenge his worst instincts. The pain of betrayal remained a physical ache beneath my ribs, but alongside it, something else was taking shape, a cold, clear determination. Robert believed he had won. He believed I would sign these papers, take the money and disappear into obscurity while he drove our company toward his vision of success. What he didn't understand, what he had always underestimated, was exactly what I was capable of when pushed to my limits. When Patricia, Marcus, and Brittany returned to the conference room, they found me sitting calmly, the agreement closed, before me. "Have you had sufficient time to review the terms?" Marcus asked, retaking his seat. "Yes," I replied, "and I have a counter-proposal." The surprise on their faces would have been amusing under different circumstances. "A counter-proposal isn't really the purpose of this meeting," Brittany began, her tone condescending. "Nevertheless, I have one," I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word. I'll sign the agreement as written, with one modification to the non-compete clause. Marcus frowned. The non-compete is a standard. I want it reduced to 6 months instead of 3 years, I interrupted. Mr. Morgan was very specific about the 3-year term, Brittany said, her expression hardening. I looked directly at her, seeing for the first time not just my replacement but my opponent. Then Mr. Morgan can tell me that himself. I won't negotiate my future with his proxy. The tension in the room shifted palpably. This wasn't proceeding according to the script Robert had prepared. I'll need to consult with Mr. Morgan, Marcus said, gathering his papers. You do that, I replied. I'll wait. As they filed out, leaving me alone again, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. This small act of resistance, this refusal to simply comply with Robert's terms, was the first step toward reclaiming my agency. I didn't yet know how I would rebuild from these ashes. I couldn't imagine that 6 months later I would stand at the head of a conference table, watching Robert's face contort with shock as I announced my ownership of the company he had taken from me. I had no way of knowing that this crushing defeat would eventually lead to my greatest triumph, or that my cancer treatment would succeed beyond my doctor's expectations. But in this moment, in this sterile conference room where Robert had intended to finalize my corporate execution, I, Sarah Morgan, made a silent promise to myself. This was not the end of my story. It was merely the beginning of a new chapter. One that Robert Morgan would come to regret provoking with every fiber of his being. 45 minutes later, the door to conference room B opened again. Robert Morgan entered alone, his presence immediately filling the small space with a tension that hadn't existed before. He wore the grey custom suit I had given him for his last birthday, the irony of which wasn't lost on me. I understand we have a problem with the terms, he said without preamble, taking the seat across from me. Gone was any pretense of the man I had married. This was Robert Morgan, CEO of Morgan Family Restaurants, handling a business complication. Not a problem, I replied calmly. A counteroffer. Robert studied me, perhaps surprised by my composure. He had likely expected tears, emotional pleas, the overreaction he had always accused me of during our disagreements. The 3-year non-compete is non-negotiable, he said finally. The board is adamant about protecting Morgan Restaurants. Interests? The board, I repeated, or you? Something flickered across his face, irritation perhaps at being challenged. In this case, our interests align perfectly. You know too much about our strategy, our suppliers, our recipes. 3 years gives us adequate protection. It also ensures I can't work in my field until my cancer either kills me or is in full remission, I observed. Quite convenient for you. Robert leaned back, his expression hardening. This isn't personal, Sarah. It's business. The words hung in the air between us, so patently false that I almost laughed. Nothing could be more personal than this. The man who had shared my bed, my dreams, my business, now clinically excising me from all 3 while I was battling cancer. If it were just business, I said carefully, you would have bought me out months ago when we first disagreed about the expansion strategy. Instead, you built a case against me, documented our strategic disagreements as my failures, and presented them to the board only after you'd secured their loyalty and found yourself a replacement. Robert's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. Am I? I leaned forward. Tell me something, Robert. When did it start with Brittany? Before or after my diagnosis? That's irrelevant to these proceedings, he replied coldly. Indulge me. It's the least you can do. Robert checked his watch, a gesture I recognized from countless meetings when he was growing impatient. If you must know, Brittany and I recognized our compatibility about a year ago, but that has nothing to do with this business decision. A year. While I had been working 70-hour weeks helping build our restaurant empire, Robert had been pursuing my eventual replacement, professionally and personally. The timeline made the betrayal even more calculated than I had imagined. "I see," I said, my voice steady despite the fresh wave of pain his admission triggered. "Well, since we're being so honest with each other, let me be clear about something. I built this company alongside you. Every restaurant we opened, every menu we developed, every dollar of funding we secured, I was there. You don't get to rewrite that history just because it's inconvenient for your new narrative." Robert's expression remained impassive, but I could see the subtle signs of his growing frustration, the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible tap of his index finger against the table. "No one is denying your early contributions," he said, his tone measured. "But companies evolve, Sarah. What Morgan Restaurants needs now isn't what it needed 5 years ago. Your conservative approach was holding us back from necessary growth. My conservative approach kept us solvent during the 2020 downturn when 3 of our competitors folded," I countered. "My conservative approach is why we have a cash reserve while others operate on loans and prayer." Robert's patience was visibly thinning. "This is exactly why we're here today. You see threats everywhere, Sarah. I see opportunities. The restaurant world rewards bold moves, not cautious hedging. The restaurant world is littered with the corpses of businesses that made bold moves on borrowed money," I replied. I reached for the agreement, flipping to the non-compete section. 1 year, that's my offer. 1 year, and I sign everything else as is." Robert studied me for a long moment, calculation evident in his gaze. 2 years. Final offer. I considered. 2 years was still a significant handicap, but wasn't the professional death sentence that 3 years would have been in the rapidly evolving Portland restaurant scene. "Fine, 2 years," I agreed. "Have legal redraft it and I'll sign this afternoon." Robert nodded once, standing to signal the end of our negotiation. He hesitated for a moment, as if there was something more he wanted to say. Whatever it was, he thought better of it. "The revised agreement will be ready by 3, he said, moving toward the door. "Robert," I said, stopping him before he could leave. "One more thing." He turned, his hand already on the door handle. "You've won. You have the company, the board's support, and Brittany. You have everything you want." I met his gaze directly. "Remember this moment." Something like unease flickered across Robert's face before he masked it with a businesslike nod. "Goodbye, Sarah." The door closed behind him, and I was alone again in the sterile conference room. The conversation had transpired exactly as Robert had planned, except for my small victory on the non-compete clause. He had arrived expecting capitulation and instead encountered resistance. It was minimal, certainly, but it was something. I gathered my things slowly, in no rush to leave this final act of my time at Morgan Restaurants. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see life continuing in the office beyond. Employees at their desks, conversations in the hallway, the mundane rhythm of corporate existence undisturbed by the personal and professional earthquake I had just experienced. As I stepped out of conference room B for the last time, I felt oddly disconnected from my surroundings, as if I were observing the scene from a great distance. The restaurant offices, once so familiar, now seemed alien, a place where I no longer belonged. I made my way to my office to collect my personal belongings, aware of the eyes following my progress. The corner office that had been mine since we opened our second location was already being packed up, 2 facilities employees carefully removing my awards from the walls. "Mrs. Morgan," one of them said, looking uncomfortable. "We were told to have this cleared by end of day. I'm sorry, we didn't know you'd be coming by." "It's fine," I said, noting that the plants I had carefully tended for years had already been removed. I just need a few personal items. I gathered what remained. A small jade figurine that had been my grandmother's, a fountain pen from my first restaurant mentor, a framed photograph of my parents. So little to show for years of my life invested in these walls. Across the floor, through the glass partition that separated our offices, I could see Robert in conversation with Brittany. They weren't touching. They were too professional for that in the office, but there was an intimacy to their posture that spoke volumes. They were already planning, already moving forward into the future they had constructed on the ruins of my past. As I placed my office key and security badge on the desk, my final surrender of the company I had helped build, something shifted within me. The pain was still there, a physical presence beneath my ribs, but it had transformed into something harder, more defined. Not yet determination, not quite resolve, but perhaps their precursor, a silent refusal to let this moment define the rest of my life. The elevator ride to the lobby was silent, the small box of personal items in my arms pathetically inadequate to represent what I had lost. In the reflective doors, I caught a glimpse of myself, still composed, still dignified, still standing, despite everything that had been taken from me. Outside, Portland's notoriously fickle weather had shifted. The morning's clear skies had been replaced by gathering storm clouds that matched my internal landscape. As I placed my box in the passenger seat of my car, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, quickly becoming a downpour that obscured the restaurant building behind sheets of water. I sat motionless behind the wheel, watching as employees hurried in and out of the building's entrance, umbrellas unfurling against the deluge. Somewhere in that building, Robert and Brittany were continuing their day, perhaps already discussing who would take over my responsibilities, how they would distribute my projects. The thought should have devastated me anew, but instead, something unexpected happened. As rain pounded against the car roof, creating a cocoon of white noise around me, I felt a moment of perfect clarity break through the emotional chaos of the past 24 hours. Robert had taken my marriage. He had taken my company. He had taken my professional reputation, but he couldn't take my knowledge, my experience, my capabilities. Those remained firmly, irrevocably mine. The realization wasn't comfort exactly. The wounds were too fresh, too deep for anything approaching solace. But it was a foothold, a small, solid place to stand in the midst of the destruction. I started the car, the familiar hum of the engine, grounding me in the present moment. I had nowhere particular to go. The house I had shared with Robert no longer felt like home, and my office was no longer mine. I was, for perhaps the first time in my adult life, completely untethered. The sensation was terrifying. It was also, I realized with surprise, oddly freeing. As I pulled away from Morgan family restaurants for what I believed was the last time, I had no way of knowing what the next 6 months would bring. I couldn't imagine the company I would build, the strategies I would develop, the path that would eventually lead me back to this very building, not as an ousted co-founder, but as its owner. All I knew in that moment was that the story Robert had written for me, the narrative of the cautious, emotional wife who couldn't keep pace with his vision, now further burdened by illness, was not the story I would accept. If I had to start again from nothing, I would. If I had to reinvent myself entirely, I would do that too. The rain continued to fall as I drove away from my past and toward an unwritten future. Behind the wheel of my car, in the privacy of this transitional space between what had been and what would be, I made a decision that would alter the course of my life. And though I didn't know it yet, Robert's as well. I would not disappear. I would not fade into obscurity. I would not become the cautionary tale of the woman left behind by a visionary ex-husband while battling cancer. Instead, I would become something Robert had never anticipated, never prepared for. A worthy opponent. The thought wasn't revenge, not exactly. It was something more fundamental, a refusal to accept the ending Robert had scripted for me, a decision to write my own story, whatever it might be. As I navigated through Portland's rain-slicked streets, I had no destination in mind. But for the first time since Robert had walked out of our bedroom with his packed suitcase, I had something almost as important: a direction. The days immediately following my departure from Morgan Restaurants passed in a blur of practical necessities and medical appointments. I signed the revised separation agreement with its 2-year non-compete clause without further negotiation. I put the house I had shared with Robert on the market, unable to bear the echoing emptiness of spaces once filled with shared ambitions. I moved into a minimalist downtown apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River, a clean slate devoid of memories. These actions were performed with mechanical efficiency, my emotional responses temporarily suspended as I focused on the logistics of dismantling my former life. Friends and family expressed concern about my composed demeanor, expecting tears or rage that never materialized. What they couldn't see was that beneath this calm exterior, I was meticulously analyzing my situation with the same strategic thinking I had once applied to our restaurant chain's business challenges. All the while, I continued my cancer treatment, weekly chemotherapy sessions that left me drained but determined. The oncology center became my new normal, a place where nurses knew my name and fellow patients nodded in recognition. There, in the chemo suite with its reclining chairs and IV poles, I began to forge a new identity, one defined not by what I had lost, but by what I was fighting to preserve: my life. 1 month after signing the separation agreement, on a crisp autumn morning, following my 4th round of chemotherapy, I sat at my new dining table with a blank notebook before me. The page was headed with a single question: what now? The non-compete agreement prevented me from working directly in restaurant management or culinary consulting in the Pacific Northwest for 2 years, the field I had dedicated my career to thus far. Robert had effectively blocked my most obvious path forward, but as I stared at the blank page, I recognized that this restriction, while significant, was also narrowly defined. I couldn't create restaurants that competed with Morgan family restaurants for 2 years. I couldn't work for Robert's competitors in the region. But there were no restrictions on education, on investment activities, or on developing expertise in adjacent industries. The realization sparked the first genuine smile I had experienced since Robert's departure. He had tried to build a cage, but had left multiple doors unlocked. By evening, my blank page had transformed into a complex mind map detailing potential paths forward. 3 main branches emerged from my central question: knowledge development, gaining expertise in areas complementary to, but not directly competing with, my existing skill set. Network building, cultivating relationships with key players in the Portland business community who might become allies in my future endeavors. Financial positioning, strategically investing my settlement money to build resources for whatever came next. Over the following weeks, these 3 branches became my roadmap. I enrolled in an intensive financial analysis program at Portland State University, focusing specifically on business valuation and investment strategies. I joined 3 business organizations, carefully selecting those that Robert had always dismissed as unnecessary networking. Most significantly, I reached out to Lisa Chen, who had left Morgan Restaurants shortly after my departure. "I'm not asking you to betray any confidences," I assured Lisa over coffee at a quiet cafe far from our former offices. "I just want to understand what's happening in the industry from someone whose judgment I trust." Lisa studied me carefully before responding. As I prepared for my dinner with Eleanor, selecting a sharp black suit that symbolized this new chapter, I reflected on how completely my journey had transformed me. The devastated woman who had sat paralyzed in her car outside Morgan Restaurants. Headquarters nearly 14 months ago had evolved into someone new, someone with clearer vision, colder calculation, and absolute confidence in her ability to recognize and seize the right moment when it came. That moment, I now believed, was rapidly approaching. And when it arrived, Robert Morgan would discover just how thoroughly he had underestimated the woman he had discarded. My final round of chemotherapy coincided with the 18th month of my separation from Morgan Restaurants. The symbolism wasn't lost on me as I sat in the oncology center's reclining chair, watching the last drops of medication flow through the IV into my arm. Two battles fought simultaneously, one against cancer, one against professional extinction, both approaching their resolution. "How does it feel to be finishing treatment?" my regular nurse asked as she removed the IV. I considered the question carefully. "Like finishing the preparation phase of something much larger," I replied. "Necessary, difficult, but ultimately just the foundation for what comes next." She smiled, accustomed to my unusual perspective. "Most patients say they feel relieved or scared. I'm both of those too," I admitted, "but mostly I feel ready. Ready indeed." As I left the cancer center for the last time as a patient, my phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor. "Board contact confirms NW Morgan merger announcement scheduled for next week. Financial package prepared. Team standing by." The pieces were falling into place with a precision that might have seemed like fate to someone less strategic. But I knew better. This wasn't destiny. It was the culmination of careful planning, patient waiting, and the leveraging of Robert's fundamental misunderstanding of who I truly was. While he had been building his restaurant empire through acquisition and debt, I had been building something much less visible, but potentially more powerful. A mechanism for reclaiming what he had taken, precisely when he was most vulnerable. The timing was exquisite. The non-compete agreement that had prevented me from working in restaurant management in the Pacific Northwest would expire in exactly 6 weeks, just as the financial pressures from the merger would be reaching their peak intensity. That evening, standing in my apartment looking out at Portland's lights, I allowed myself to fully embrace the plan that had been forming for months. Not just a strategy for financial gain, not merely a path back to professional relevance, but a complete reversal of fortune that would restore what was rightfully mine. Tomorrow, Blackwell Morgan Investments would begin the final phase of preparation for the most significant move in its brief history. The target was familiar, the timing impeccable, and the executor, a woman Robert Morgan had gravely underestimated, was finally ready to act. The only remaining question was how sweet the victory would taste when it finally arrived. Not that it mattered. This wasn't about satisfaction or revenge, though both would surely come. This was about justice, restoration, and the righting of a wrong that had been perpetrated when I was at my most vulnerable. As the city lights twinkled below, I made a silent promise to myself and to the company I had helped build. I was coming home, and this time nothing, not cancer, not Robert, not all the legal maneuvering in the world, would stop me from reclaiming what was mine. Exactly 18 months and 1 day after signing the separation agreement with Morgan Family Restaurants, I sat in the pristine conference room of Blackwell Morgan Investments, surrounded by my carefully assembled team of financial analysts, industry experts, and legal advisors. The wall-to-wall windows offered a panoramic view of Portland's skyline, with Morgan Restaurants' headquarters clearly visible in the distance, a visual reminder of our target. "The non-compete restriction expires in 6 weeks, I began, my voice steady as I addressed the room. "As of that day, we are free to pursue any opportunity in the restaurant and hospitality space, including potential actions involving Morgan Family Restaurants." Eleanor Blackwell, who had become my closest advisor and BMI's principal investor, leaned forward. And the timing couldn't be better. The Morgan Northwest merger announcement yesterday triggered exactly the market response we anticipated. On the large screen at the front of the room, financial charts displayed Morgan Restaurant's stock performance, a sharp 18% decline following the merger announcement. The market had reacted with the skepticism that I had predicted, recognizing the fundamental flaws in combining two companies with over-leveraged balance sheets and questionable synergies. Our analysis suggests that Morgan will need to secure additional financing within the next 2 months to complete the merger and manage the consolidated debt, explained Rajiv Mehta, BMI's lead financial strategist. Given the current interest rate environment and the restaurant sector's cooling growth, they'll face significant challenges in obtaining favorable terms. I nodded, the scenario unfolding exactly as I had projected, and their existing creditors? Increasingly nervous, Rajiv confirmed. I've had informal conversations with representatives from Pacific Northwest Bank, who hold the largest portion of Morgan's current debt. They're concerned about the company's direction, but aren't yet ready to take action. For 2 hours, the team methodically reviewed our intelligence on Morgan Restaurant's vulnerable position. The company was not yet in crisis. It remained profitable and maintained strong brand recognition, but Robert's aggressive expansion strategy had created precarious financial scaffolding that could collapse under the right pressure. After the meeting concluded, Eleanor remained behind while the others filed out. She studied me with the shrewd assessment that had made her one of Portland's most successful investors. "We've prepared for this moment for nearly 18 months, Eleanor observed. "You've built BMI specifically to position yourself for this opportunity. But I need to ask the question everyone's thinking but no one dares to voice. Is this about sound business strategy or personal vindication?" I met her gaze directly. "Both," I answered with uncharacteristic candor. "I won't pretend there isn't personal satisfaction in the prospect of reclaiming what Robert took from me. But that wouldn't be enough to justify the financial risk we're contemplating." I stood, moving to the window to look out at Morgan Restaurant's headquarters. The merger with Northwest is fundamentally flawed for all the reasons outlined in our analysis. It's driven by Robert's ego and ambition rather than sound business judgment. Morgan Restaurants is worth saving from his mismanagement, not just for me, but for the employees who remain, the customers who love our food, and yes, for our investors who stand to profit significantly if we execute this correctly. Eleanor joined me at the window, seemingly satisfied with my response. "Then let's make the next move." The following weeks saw Blackwell Morgan Investments executing a carefully orchestrated strategy. While remaining below the reporting thresholds that would require public disclosure, BMI began acquiring small positions in Morgan Restaurants through various investment vehicles. Simultaneously, I initiated discreet conversations with key Morgan board members, institutional investors, and creditors. The approach was surgical in its precision, not a hostile takeover attempt, but a methodical positioning as a potential solution to the growing concerns about Morgan's direction under Robert's leadership. 6 weeks after the merger announcement, the day my non-compete agreement officially expired, the pivotal moment I had anticipated arrived. Morgan Restaurant's quarterly earnings report showed the company missing projections for the first time in its history, with cash reserves dangerously depleted by acquisition costs. The stock dropped another 14% in a single day, triggering margin calls for several large investors and creating a cascade of forced selling. That evening, I received the call I had been waiting for. James Patterson's name appeared on my phone screen, his timing as predictable as I had anticipated. "The board has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow," James said without preamble. The Northwest merger is falling apart. Their financials are even worse than you suspected last year. They've been hiding substantial losses with accounting tricks that came to light during final due diligence. That's unfortunate timing for Robert, I replied, carefully neutral. In my response, unfortunate doesn't begin to cover it, James continued. The banks are threatening to call in their loans unless we bring in new leadership and capital immediately. Several board members mentioned your name today. They've heard about Blackwell Morgan Investments and your recent activities. I allowed a moment of silence before responding. And what exactly are you asking, James? Would BMI consider a significant investment in Morgan Restaurants combined with a leadership change? The question was direct, exactly what I had been positioning for over the past 18 months. We might, I replied, maintaining my professional composure despite the surge of vindication I felt. I'd need to review the current financials, the real ones, not the version presented to analysts, and any discussion would need to include complete leadership restructuring, not just cosmetic changes. The board meets at 9 a.m. tomorrow, James said. Could you present a preliminary proposal by then? I'll see you at 9, I confirmed, ending the call with a steady hand despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. For the next 12 hours, I and my team worked without pause, preparing a comprehensive rescue package for Morgan Restaurants. The proposal was meticulously crafted to appeal to the board's urgent needs, while establishing terms that would give BMI, and by extension, me, controlling interest in the company. At precisely 8:45 the following morning, I walked through the revolving doors of Morgan Restaurants headquarters for the first time in 18 months. The security guard at the front desk did a double take, recognition dawning on his face. Mrs. Morgan, it's been a while. Hello, Michael, I replied with a genuine smile. I have a meeting with the board. Brace. As I rode the elevator to the executive floor, I experienced an odd sense of déjà vu. The same elevator, the same subtle scent of the building's ventilation system, yet everything fundamentally different. I was no longer the discarded co-founder, leaving with a box of personal belongings. I was now CEO of Blackwell Morgan Investments, arriving with a lifeline that Morgan Restaurants desperately needed. The boardroom looked exactly as I remembered it. The long cherry table, the views of Mount Hood on clear days, the subtle displays of corporate success on the walls. 8 board members were already seated when I entered, their expressions a mix of anxiety, curiosity, and in some cases, visible discomfort at my presence. James Patterson rose to greet me. Thank you for coming on such short notice, Sarah. The board is eager to hear BMI's perspective on Morgan's current situation. I took the offered seat, placing my presentation materials on the table. I noted Robert's conspicuous absence with mild surprise. Before we begin, I said, I'd like to understand who will be joining us. I was expecting the full board, including the CEO. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Finally, Patricia Winters, the board chair, cleared her throat. Robert was asked not to attend this particular meeting. Given the nature of our discussion, potential new investment and leadership changes, the board felt it would be more productive to speak freely. The revelation was unexpected but advantageous. Robert had already been sidelined, making my proposal easier to present without immediate resistance. For the next hour, I outlined BMI's analysis of Morgan Restaurants' current challenges and our proposed solution. A significant capital injection in exchange for controlling interest, immediate termination of the Northwest merger, and complete restructuring of executive leadership. Our due diligence confirms that Morgan's core business remains strong, I explained, my command of the company's finances clearly impressing the board. The current crisis stems from over-leveraging and strategic missteps in acquisition targets, not fundamental concept or market failures. I deliberately avoided any personal references to my history with the company or with Robert, maintaining strictly professional language as I detailed BMI's rescue plan. The board members asked pointed questions about timelines, financial terms, and leadership transitions, all of which I addressed with composed expertise. As the discussion progressed, I could feel the energy in the room shifting. The initial wariness was being replaced by cautious optimism as board members recognized that BMI's proposal represented their best option for averting a complete collapse. "There's one aspect we haven't discussed explicitly," Patricia said as the presentation concluded. "Leadership. Your proposal references executive restructuring, but doesn't specify who would lead Morgan Restaurants through this transition and beyond." The moment I had prepared for had arrived. I closed my portfolio deliberately before responding. BMI's investment would be contingent on installation of new leadership with proven experience in restaurant operations and intimate knowledge of Morgan's culture, customers, and culinary philosophy. I stated, given those requirements, I would step in as interim CEO during the stabilization period. The statement hung in the air, its implications fully registering with each board member. I watched as expressions shifted from surprise to calculation to gradual acceptance. For some, like James Patterson, there was even visible relief. "You built this company once," James observed. "You understand it better than anyone. And that's precisely why I'm uniquely qualified to save it now," I confirmed, my confidence absolute. Patricia exchanged glances with several other board members before addressing me again. "We'll need to deliberate on BMI's proposal, but speaking personally, I find the terms reasonable given our situation. How quickly could you move forward if the board approves?" "BMI is prepared to execute immediately," I replied. "Our legal team has draft agreements ready and the capital is secured. We could announce the investment and leadership change as early as tomorrow morning, before markets open." The speed of my response clearly impressed the board, reinforcing the image of BMI as a decisive, prepared savior rather than an opportunistic vulture. "There is one other matter," I added, my tone remaining professional despite the personal satisfaction I felt at what would come next. "Any agreement would require immediate termination of Robert Morgan's position and comprehensive review of recent executive decisions, including the proposed Northwest merger and several other questionable transactions our analysis has identified." This was the first direct reference to Robert, delivered as a non-negotiable business condition rather than personal vengeance. Patricia nodded slowly. "The board has already reached the painful conclusion that a leadership change is necessary. Your condition aligns with our own assessment." As the meeting concluded, I was asked to wait in an adjacent conference room while the board deliberated. Through the glass walls, I could see their animated discussion, the occasional glance in my direction, the gradual nodding of heads as consensus formed. Exactly 37 minutes later, Patricia entered the conference room where I waited. "The board has voted unanimously to accept Blackwell Morgan Investments' proposal, subject to final legal review of the terms. We're prepared to move forward with the leadership transition immediately." I stood, extending my hand to the board chair. Morgan Restaurants has a strong foundation and dedicated team. With proper leadership and strategic direction, I'm confident we can stabilize the situation quickly. "There is one detail you should be aware of," Patricia added with slight hesitation. "Robert doesn't yet know about the board's decision. He's scheduled to be in the office this afternoon for what he believes is an update on the Northwest situation. Given your history, would you prefer that we handle that conversation before you assume your position?" I considered the option briefly, before shaking my head. No, that won't be necessary. As Morgan's new CEO, handling difficult transitions will be part of my responsibility. I'll speak with Robert personally. As Patricia left to inform the rest of the board of their decision, I remained alone in the conference room, the magnitude of what had just transpired washing over me. 18 months of meticulous planning, strategic positioning, and patient waiting had culminated in this moment of complete reversal. Robert had forced me out of the company we had built together, believing he was eliminating an obstacle to his ambitions. Now I would return as his successor, tasked with saving Morgan Restaurants from the very risks I had warned against. The symmetry was so perfect it almost seemed scripted, yet I knew it was the result not of fate, but of careful calculation. My ability to recognize Robert's fundamental weaknesses and position myself precisely where I needed to be when those weaknesses inevitably created vulnerability. I looked out at the Portland skyline from the conference room windows, feeling neither triumph nor revenge, but a calm certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Morgan Restaurants was my company, had always been my company in the ways that truly mattered. Now I would have the opportunity to prove it, not just to Robert, but to everyone. The pivotal moment of my transformation was complete. Sarah Morgan, once discarded as irrelevant to Morgan Restaurants' future, was now the only person who could secure that future. And Robert Morgan was about to discover just how profound a miscalculation he had made in underestimating the woman he had betrayed. News of the board's decision traveled through Morgan Restaurants' headquarters with astonishing speed. By the time I left the boardroom, the executive floor was already buzzing with whispered conversations and speculative glances. Employees who remembered me from before stopped mid-stride, their expressions cycling through recognition, confusion, and, in many cases, barely concealed hope. Diana Matthews, who had been my assistant years ago before being reassigned after Robert's takeover, approached with visible emotion. "Mrs. Morgan, is it true? Are you coming back to Morgan Restaurants?" I smiled warmly at the familiar face. "Yes, Diana, though the official announcement won't be made until tomorrow morning." Diana's professional composure momentarily cracked, revealing genuine relief. "The company needs you. It hasn't been the same since—" She stopped herself, glancing around nervously. "I understand," I reassured her, "and I appreciate your discretion. Until the formal announcement, would you know if Robert is in the building yet?" "Mr. Morgan is scheduled to arrive at 2:02 for the Northwest update meeting," Diana confirmed. "He's been working from home most mornings recently." This information aligned perfectly with my plans. I had 4 hours to prepare for the conversation that would culminate my 18-month journey from ousted co-founder to returning CEO. "I'll need temporary access to the system and a meeting room for the afternoon," I said. "And please clear my old office. I'll be using it immediately following the board's announcement tomorrow." "Your old office?" Diana's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's Mr. Morgan's office now." "I'm aware," I replied simply. "Please make the necessary arrangements." As Diana hurried off to implement these requests, James Patterson approached from the boardroom. "The legal team is preparing the final documents. They'll be ready for signatures by this afternoon." He hesitated before adding, "Are you certain you want to handle the conversation with Robert personally? It could be volatile." "I'm certain," I confirmed. "Some conversations need to happen face to face." The hours before Robert's arrival passed in a whirlwind of activity. I met with the financial team to get real-time data on Morgan's position. I reviewed the employee roster, noting who remained from my era and who had been brought in by Robert. I studied the most recent menu development plans, quickly identifying strengths to maintain and weaknesses to address. Throughout these meetings, I maintained absolute professionalism, betraying no hint of personal satisfaction at my imminent return to power. But beneath this composed exterior, I was acutely aware of the approaching moment when I would face Robert directly, not as his discarded wife and partner, but as the person who now held his professional fate in her hands. At precisely 1:55 p.m., I positioned myself in conference room A, adjacent to the main boardroom, where Robert was scheduled to meet with Patricia and several other board members at 2:00. Through the glass walls, I could observe without being immediately visible, giving the board time to deliver the initial news before I joined the conversation. Robert arrived at 2:10, his characteristic 10 minutes late, a power move he had always employed to remind others of his perceived importance. From my vantage point, I could see him clearly, the same confident stride, the same perfectly tailored suit, the same practiced smile as he greeted the board members. He seemed entirely unaware of the professional execution he was walking into. Even from a distance, I could pinpoint the exact moment when Robert realized something was wrong. His posture stiffened, the smile froze and then disappeared. His hand that had been gesturing emphatically dropped to his side. Patricia was speaking, her expression grave, the other board members watching Robert's reaction with careful neutrality. Robert suddenly stood, his movement so abrupt that his chair rolled backward and hit the wall behind him. He was speaking. Rapidly, his gestures becoming more animated as Patricia continued to deliver what was clearly unwelcome news. Though I couldn't hear the words, the body language told the story clearly. Denial, anger, attempted negotiation, all cycling through in quick succession. Patricia glanced toward conference room A, the prearranged signal indicating it was time for me to join them. With a deep breath, I gathered my materials and walked the short distance to the boardroom, my heels clicking rhythmically on the polished floor in a steady cadence that matched my heartbeat. When I pushed open the boardroom door, Robert's back was to me. He was still arguing with Patricia, his voice raised enough that I caught the end of his statement. Completely unacceptable. The board can't possibly think that bringing in outside investors without my approval is anything but... The board's decision is unanimous, Robert, Patricia interrupted firmly. And the investor isn't an outsider, not to Morgan Restaurants. At that moment, Robert sensed the presence behind him and turned. The sequence of emotions that crossed his face in the next 3 seconds was something I would remember for the rest of my life. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally, a dawning horror as understanding settled in. "Hello, Robert," I said calmly, moving to the table and placing my portfolio on its polished surface. "It's been a while." Robert stared at me as if I were an apparition. "What is this?" he demanded, looking from me to Patricia and back again. "What is she doing here?" "Ms. Morgan is the CEO of Blackwell Morgan Investments," Patricia explained with professional detachment. "As I was explaining, the board has accepted BMI's investment proposal, which includes a leadership change effective immediately." The B color drained from Robert's face as the full implications registered. "This is a joke," he said, though his expression suggested he already knew it wasn't. "Sarah doesn't have the resources or experience to... Blackwell Morgan Investments has secured $20 million in committed capital," I interrupted, my voice steady. "Our due diligence on Morgan Restaurants has been thorough, including comprehensive analysis of the failed Northwest merger that has placed the company in its current precarious position." A muscle twitched in Robert's jaw, a tell I recognized from our marriage, a sign of fury barely contained. Robert had forced me out of the company we had built together, believing he was eliminating an obstacle to his ambitions. Now I would return as his successor, tasked with saving Morgan Restaurants from the very risks I had warned against. The symmetry was so perfect it almost seemed scripted. Yet I knew it was the result not of fate, but of careful calculation. My ability to recognize Robert's fundamental weaknesses and position myself precisely where I needed to be when those weaknesses inevitably created vulnerability. I looked out at the Portland skyline from the conference room windows, feeling neither triumph nor revenge, but a calm certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Morgan Restaurants was my company, had always been my company in the ways that truly mattered. Now I would have the opportunity to prove it, not just to Robert, but to everyone. The pivotal moment of my transformation was complete. Sarah Morgan, once discarded as irrelevant to Morgan Restaurants' future, was now the only person who could secure that future. And Robert Morgan was about to discover just how profound a miscalculation he had made in underestimating the woman he had betrayed. News of the board's decision traveled through Morgan Restaurants' headquarters with astonishing speed. By the time I left the boardroom, the executive floor was already buzzing with whispered conversations and speculative glances. Employees who remembered me from before stopped mid-stride, their expressions cycling through recognition, confusion, and, in many cases, barely concealed hope. Diana Matthews, who had been my assistant years ago before being reassigned after Robert's takeover, approached with visible emotion. "Mrs. Morgan, is it true? Are you coming back to Morgan Restaurants?" I smiled warmly at the familiar face. "Yes, Diana, though the official announcement won't be made until tomorrow morning." Diana's professional composure momentarily cracked, revealing genuine relief. "The company needs you. It hasn't been the same since—" She stopped herself, glancing around nervously. "I understand," I reassured her, "and I appreciate your discretion. Until the formal announcement, would you know if Robert is in the building yet?" "Mr. Morgan is scheduled to arrive at 2:02 for the Northwest Update meeting," Diana confirmed. "He's been working from home most mornings recently." This information aligned perfectly with my plans. I had 4 hours to prepare for the conversation that would culminate my 18-month journey from ousted co-founder to returning CEO. "I'll need temporary access to the system and a meeting room for the afternoon," I said. "And please clear my old office. I'll be using it immediately following the board's announcement tomorrow." "Your old office?" Diana's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's Mr. Morgan's office now." "I'm aware," I replied simply. "Please make the necessary arrangements." As Diana hurried off to implement these requests, James Patterson approached from the boardroom. "The legal team is preparing the final documents. They'll be ready for signatures by this afternoon." He hesitated before adding, "Are you certain you want to handle the conversation with Robert personally? It could be volatile." "I'm certain," I confirmed. "Some conversations need to happen face to face." The hours before Robert's arrival passed in a whirlwind of activity. I met with the financial team to get real-time data on Morgan's position. I reviewed the employee roster, noting who remained from my era and who had been brought in by Robert. I studied the most recent menu development plans, quickly identifying strengths to maintain and weaknesses to address. Throughout these meetings, I maintained absolute professionalism, betraying no hint of personal satisfaction at my imminent return to power. But beneath this composed exterior, I was acutely aware of the approaching moment when I would face Robert directly, not as his discarded wife and partner, but as the person who now held his professional fate in her hands. At precisely 1:55 p.m., I positioned myself in conference room A, adjacent to the main boardroom, where Robert was scheduled to meet with Patricia and several other board members at 2:00. Through the glass walls, I could observe without being immediately visible, giving the board time to deliver the initial news before I joined the conversation. Robert arrived at 2:10, his characteristic 10 minutes late, a power move he had always employed to remind others of his perceived importance. From my vantage point, I could see him clearly. The same confident stride, the same perfectly tailored suit, the same practiced smile as he greeted the board members. He seemed entirely unaware of the professional execution he was walking into. Even from a distance, I could pinpoint the exact moment when Robert realized something was wrong. His posture stiffened. The smile froze and then disappeared. His hand that had been gesturing emphatically dropped to his side. Patricia was speaking, her expression grave, the other board members watching Robert's reaction with careful neutrality. Robert suddenly stood, his movement so abrupt that his chair rolled backward and hit the wall behind him. He was speaking. Rapidly, his gestures becoming more animated as Patricia continued to deliver what was clearly unwelcome news. Though I couldn't hear the words, the body language told the story clearly. Denial, anger, attempted negotiation, all cycling through in quick succession. Patricia glanced toward conference room A, the prearranged signal indicating it was time for me to join them. With a deep breath, I gathered my materials and walked the short distance to the boardroom, my heels clicking rhythmically on the polished floor in a steady cadence that matched my heartbeat. When I pushed open the boardroom door, Robert's back was to me. He was still arguing with Patricia, his voice raised enough that I caught the end of his statement. Completely unacceptable. The board can't possibly think that bringing in outside investors without my approval is anything but... The board's decision is unanimous, Robert, Patricia interrupted firmly. And the investor isn't an outsider, not to Morgan Restaurants. At that moment, Robert sensed the presence behind him and turned. The sequence of emotions that crossed his face in the next 3 seconds was something I would remember for the rest of my life. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally, a dawning horror as understanding settled in. "Hello, Robert," I said calmly, moving to the table and placing my portfolio on its polished surface. "It's been a while." Robert stared at me as if I were an apparition. "What is this?" he demanded, looking from me to Patricia and back again. "What is she doing here?" "Ms. Morgan is the CEO of Blackwell Morgan Investments," Patricia explained with professional detachment. "As I was explaining, the board has accepted BMI's investment proposal, which includes a leadership change effective immediately." The B color drained from Robert's face as the full implications registered. "This is a joke," he said, though his expression suggested he already knew it wasn't. "Sarah doesn't have the resources or experience to... Blackwell Morgan Investments has secured $20 million in committed capital," I interrupted, my voice steady. "Our due diligence on Morgan Restaurants has been thorough, including comprehensive analysis of the failed Northwest merger that has placed the company in its current precarious position." A muscle twitched in Robert's jaw, a tell I recognized from our marriage, a sign of fury barely contained. "You've been planning this," he said, the accusation barely above a whisper. "All this time you've been waiting for an opportunity to save the company we built from your mismanagement." "Yes," I maintained my professional tone despite the personal satisfaction coursing through me. "The non-compete agreement you insisted upon expired today. BMI's offer was presented to the board this morning. The timing is fortuitous." Robert turned to Patricia, attempting one last appeal. "This is a personal vendetta, not business strategy. Surely the board can see that." "What the board sees," Patricia cut in firmly, "is a company on the verge of financial crisis due to your acquisition strategy and a concrete rescue plan presented by someone with intimate knowledge of Morgan's operations. Ms. Morgan's history with the company is an asset in this situation, not a liability." Robert's gaze swept the room, searching for allies and finding none. The board members who had supported his leadership for years now sat in uncomfortable silence, their loyalties shifted to the company's survival rather than its current CEO. "The terms of your separation are outlined here," I said, sliding a document across the table toward him. "The board has approved a generous severance package contingent upon immediate transition and your full cooperation during the announcement, period." Robert didn't reach for the document. Instead, he focused entirely on me, his initial shock now hardening into cold fury. "You won't be able to run this company," he said, echoing almost verbatim the words he had spoken when ending our marriage. "During my cancer diagnosis, you don't have what it takes." The parallel wasn't lost on me. For a moment, I was transported back to that devastating night in our bedroom, Robert packing his suitcase while dismissing my professional capabilities. The symmetry of this moment, the complete reversal of our positions, was so perfect it almost seemed scripted. "That's not for you to determine anymore," I replied calmly. "The decision has been made. Your access to Morgan systems will be revoked effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect personal belongings from your office." The mention of his office, once mine, soon to be mine again, seemed to finally break through Robert's disbelief. The reality of his situation crashed down upon him with visible impact. "You can't do this," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "The shareholders will be informed of the change in leadership before markets open tomorrow," Patricia interjected. "Given Morgan's recent performance and the failure of the Northwest merger, we anticipate a positive response to the announcement of new investment and leadership." Robert's phone buzzed, drawing his attention momentarily. His expression shifted as he read the message on the screen. "Brittany says you just locked her out of the system," he said, looking up with renewed anger. "What is this, Sarah? A purge of everyone associated with me?" "Not at all," I replied. "Ms. Wilson has valuable skills. She'll be offered a position in our Seattle office should she wish to remain with the company." The deliberate echo of how Robert had handled my own removal was subtle but unmistakable. Seattle was a secondary office, far from the decision-making center of Portland, a significant demotion without being an outright termination. Robert's laugh was bitter. "So that's what this is? Revenge served cold? Is that it?" I met his gaze directly. "This isn't about revenge, Robert. It's about reclaiming what we built together, what you nearly destroyed with your reckless acquisitions and over-leveraging. Morgan Restaurants is worth saving, even if your position within it isn't." The boardroom fell silent as the former spouses regarded each other across the polished cherry table. For me, the moment carried none of the vindictive satisfaction I might once have anticipated. Instead, I felt a calm certainty that this outcome was both just and necessary, not merely for my personal redemption, but for the company's survival. "Security is waiting outside," Patricia finally said, breaking the tense silence. "They'll escort you to gather your personal items." Robert's gaze remained locked on me. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Actually, it is," I replied with finality. "Goodbye, Robert." As security personnel entered the boardroom, Robert finally reached for the separation agreement, tucking it into his suit jacket without reading it. His movements were stiff, mechanical, a man operating on autopilot as his reality reconstructed itself around him. I watched as he was escorted from the room, his tall frame suddenly seeming diminished, his confident stride replaced by halting steps. The parallels to my own departure 18 months earlier were striking. The box of personal items, the revoked access, the watching eyes of colleagues as a once powerful executive was reduced to a departing employee. When Robert had disappeared from view, Patricia turned to me. "That was intense," she observed, "but handled well." "Thank you," I replied, already refocusing on the tasks ahead. "We should meet with the executive team immediately. They'll need reassurance and clear direction before tomorrow's announcement." As we prepared to address Morgan's leadership team, my phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor Blackwell. Contract signed, funding secured. Congratulations, CEO Morgan. The simple text marked the official completion of my transformation from discarded co-founder to returning savior. In just 18 months, while simultaneously battling cancer into remission, I had rebuilt myself professionally, created a successful investment firm, and positioned myself perfectly to reclaim what had been taken from me. As word of the leadership change spread through Morgan Restaurant's headquarters, I could feel the atmosphere shifting. Tension gave way to cautious optimism. Uncertainty transformed into possibilities. Employees who had witnessed my departure now watched my return, with expressions ranging from shock to relief to undisguised hope. The opportunity I had recognized and patiently waited for had arrived at precisely the right moment, when Morgan Restaurant's vulnerability aligned perfectly with my readiness to act. The timing wasn't luck. It was the product of careful observation, strategic preparation, and absolute clarity about the moment when Robert's weaknesses would create my opening. Now, as I prepared to address the executive team and begin the work of stabilizing the company I had co-founded, I carried with me not just the satisfaction of reclaiming what was mine, but the deeper knowledge that I had transformed a devastating betrayal into the catalyst for my greatest professional achievement. The opportunity had emerged exactly as I had foreseen, and I had seized it with precision, born of patience and preparation. Robert Morgan had always prided himself on recognizing market opportunities before others. Now he had learned, too late, that he had failed to recognize the most dangerous opportunity of all, the one he had created himself when he underestimated me. It was a masterful pivot, acknowledging the concerning details while reframing them as necessary sacrifices for a greater vision. James had always excelled at crafting narratives that made difficult decisions seem both inevitable and enlightened. This broader strategic vision, I responded, maintaining my composure, appears primarily focused on extracting short-term value from Meridian's assets while systematically dismantling everything that made the company successful in the first place. James sighed with practiced patience. Olivia, I understand your emotional attachment to your grandfather's company, but business strategy requires objective analysis, not sentiment. The technology landscape has changed dramatically since William Bennett's era. Has it? I challenged, stepping toward the center of the room. Have customers stopped valuing quality? Have employees stopped performing better when treated with respect? Has integrity become obsolete as a business principle? Before James could respond, I addressed the board directly. The fundamental question today isn't whether Meridian should evolve. Of course it should. The question is whether that evolution should abandon the core principles that built this company's success over 4 decades. Robert Weiss nodded, reclaiming control of the meeting. Which brings us to the matter of the founder's integrity clause. Mrs. Hamilton has indicated her intention to invoke this provision of the original corporate charter. A provision that has never been used and was likely included as a symbolic gesture rather than an enforceable governance mechanism, James interjected. Our corporate counsel has advised that such legacy provisions have questionable validity, given subsequent charter amendments. Frank Morrison spoke for the first time. As the attorney who drafted that provision with William Bennett, I can assure this board that the founder's integrity clause was designed specifically for circumstances like these. It was included with the explicit understanding that it would supersede subsequent amendments if the company's founding principles were threatened. The boardroom fell silent as Frank continued, his speech deliberate but clear. William Bennett believed that corporations, like people, required a moral compass to guide their evolution. The clause ensures that compass cannot be discarded for Temporary financial advantage. James's expression hardened. With all due respect to Mr. Morrison's historical perspective, modern corporate governance operates under different principles. The board's fiduciary duty is to maximize shareholder value. The clause doesn't prohibit maximizing value, I countered. It simply ensures that value creation aligns with the company's fundamental purpose and principles. Principles that created exceptional value for 4 decades before the current leadership began dismantling them. Robert Weiss cleared his throat. As chairman, I must ensure proper procedure is followed. Mrs. Hamilton, are you formally invoking the Founder's Integrity Clause at this time? I am. I placed the original charter document on the table, the clause in question highlighted, for all to see. As granddaughter of founder William Bennett and trustee of the Bennett Family Trust, I invoke the Founder's Integrity Clause on the grounds that the proposed Vertex acquisition fundamentally contradicts Meridian's established principles regarding product integrity, employee commitment, and corporate responsibility. For this invocation to proceed, Robert continued, it requires support from shareholders representing at least 25% of outstanding shares. Do you have documentation of such support? I nodded to Justin Parker, who distributed certified statements from our coalition members. The Bennett Family Trust controls 27% of shares. Additionally, we have formal support from shareholders representing a further 22%, for total supporting interest of 49% of outstanding shares. James examined the documents, his controlled facade cracking with genuine alarm. These shareholder statements can't be verified in real time. The board can't possibly accept them without due diligence. Each statement has been notarized and certified by independent counsel, Justin replied. But if the board requires additional verification, the shareholders in question are prepared to confirm their positions directly. Timothy Foster spoke from his seat. As an 82% shareholder, I formally confirm my support for invoking the Founder's Integrity Clause based on the evidence presented regarding the Vertex acquisition and its contradiction of Meridian's core principles. Eleanor Thompson stood next. As trustee for the Meridian Employees Investment Coalition, representing 7% of shares, I confirm our support for invoking the clause. One by one, coalition members present in the room declared their positions. With each statement, James's expression grew colder, calculations visibly running behind his eyes as the mathematical reality became undeniable. When the declarations concluded, Robert Weiss addressed the room. The threshold for invoking the Founder's Integrity Clause has been met. Per the provision's terms, this triggers special voting procedures for any matters involving corporate governance or strategic direction. This is procedural manipulation, James declared, abandoning pretense of calm acceptance. The Vertex acquisition has been under development for months, with full board participation and oversight. To derail it at the final stage based on an obscure charter provision is not just irresponsible, it's potentially actionable. The time for threats has passed, James, I said quietly. The documentation speaks for itself. You've been systematically undermining Meridian's founding principles while preparing to sell the company to an acquirer who will finish dismantling everything my grandfather built. Everything I've done has been to strengthen Meridian's market, position and ensure its future in an increasingly competitive industry, James insisted, looking around the room for support. The sentimentality Olivia is advocating would leave us vulnerable to larger competitors with fewer constraints. A tense silence followed his declaration. Even James's closest allies on the board seemed unsettled by the evidence presented and the formidable coalition arrayed against them. Walter Daniels broke the silence. I've served on this board for 15 years. I knew William Bennett personally and respected his vision for Meridian. But I've also supported James's leadership because I believed he was modernizing that vision for today's market realities. He looked directly at me. The evidence presented today suggests otherwise. These integration plans don't represent evolution of Williams' principles. They represent abandonment of them. Ashley, who had remained strategically silent throughout the proceedings, finally intervened. Mr. Daniels, with respect, these documents represent preliminary planning scenarios, not final implementation decisions. All acquisitions require exploring multiple integration approaches. And yet, Walter replied, these preliminary scenarios were sufficiently developed to include detailed technical specifications and staffing models. They appear quite intentional, Ms. Wilson. James recognized the shifting momentum and attempted to regain control. The Vertex offer represents exceptional shareholder value, a 175% premium over current market price. Regardless of integration, details that could be renegotiated, the financial benefit to all shareholders is undeniable. At what cost? I challenged. Short-term financial gain in exchange for destroying a company that has consistently delivered value for decades. That's not a strategy, it's a liquidation. Robert Weiss indicated it was time to move forward. Given the invocation of the Founders' Integrity Clause with verified shareholder support, we will proceed with the special voting provisions it requires. For matters of corporate governance and strategic direction, founding family shares receive triple voting weight. James stood, his posture rigid with barely controlled anger. I formally object to this procedural deviation and reserve all rights to challenge it legally. The Vertex agreement includes timing provisions that make today's approval imperative. Your objection is noted, Robert replied calmly. However, as chairman, I am obligated to follow the corporate charter. The special voting provisions are now in effect. What followed was a procedural battle unlike anything Meridian's boardroom had seen in its 40-year history. James and his allies attempted various parliamentary maneuvers to delay the substantive vote or separate the Vertex acquisition from the leadership questions our coalition had raised. Each attempt was methodically countered by Robert Weiss, whose decades of governance experience proved invaluable. Throughout the increasingly tense exchanges, Ashley remained in constant communication with someone via text, presumably Vertex representatives waiting to hear the outcome. Her composure slipped as the meeting extended into its third hour with no clear resolution, her expression betraying growing anxiety as the acquisition she had helped architect began to crumble. Finally, after legal clarifications and procedural challenges had been exhausted, Robert called for the formal votes. The first matter before the board is the proposed acquisition of Meridian Technologies by Vertex Technologies. A vote against the acquisition requires a simple majority under normal circumstances, but with the Founders' Integrity Clause invoked, the Bennett family trust votes carry triple weight. The vote proceeded methodically around the table. When tabulated, the result was decisive. The acquisition was rejected by a weighted vote of 62% against 38% in favor. James stared at the final tally, his expression unreadable. Ashley's face had drained of color, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The acquisition proposal is rejected, Robert announced formally. The second matter before the board concerns a vote of confidence in current executive leadership. This vote was requested by the shareholder coalition in conjunction with invoking the Founders' Integrity Clause. This time, James didn't even attempt to object, seeming to recognize the inevitable outcome. The vote of no confidence passed, by similar margins, effectively removing him as CEO, pending appointment of interim leadership. The board has expressed lack of confidence in current executive leadership, Robert stated for the record. As chairman, I call for nominations for interim CEO to guide Meridian through this transition period. Walter Daniels spoke immediately. I nominate Olivia Bennett Hamilton. As William Bennett's granddaughter and a former operations director, she combines the necessary technical knowledge with commitment to the company's founding principles. Timothy Foster seconded the nomination. Mrs. Hamilton has demonstrated remarkable insight into both Meridian's challenges and opportunities. She is the natural choice to lead the company back to its core strengths while navigating modern market realities. James finally broke his silence. This is absurd. Olivia has been effectively absent from operations for 5 years. She lacks the current industry relationships and market understanding necessary for executive leadership. What I lack in recent operational involvement, I responded calmly, I more than compensate for in understanding of what makes Meridian successful. Unlike the current leadership, I've never lost sight of the principles that built this company. See, the vote for interim CEO proceeded quickly, resulting in my appointment by a decisive margin. In the space of 3 hours, Meridian's trajectory had been completely reoriented. The Vertex acquisition terminated, James removed from leadership, and the company recommitted to its founding vision. As the meeting concluded, board members approached with congratulations, questions and concerns. Through it all, I watched James and Ashley engaged in intense conversation near the door, their expressions suggesting neither had accepted the outcome as final. Robert joined me as the room gradually emptied. Congratulations, Olivia. Your grandfather would be proud, not just of the outcome, but of how you achieved it. You built consensus around principles rather than personality. The hard work is just beginning, I acknowledged. Rebuilding what's been damaged will take time and trust. You've assembled an impressive coalition. Use it wisely. Robert glanced toward James, who was now speaking urgently into his phone. And watch your back. Corporate defeat rarely ends the battle. It just changes the battlefield. As if to emphasize his point, James approached us, his trademark corporate smile firmly in place despite the circumstances. Congratulations, Olivia. An impressive tactical victory. His tone carried a warning beneath the professional courtesy. The board has spoken, and I respect their decision. I'll coordinate with HR regarding transition protocols. Thank you, James. I'd appreciate a comprehensive briefing on all current initiatives and client relationships as soon as possible. Of course. His smile never reached his eyes. Ashley will schedule time tomorrow. I assume she'll be transitioning as well. The question carried obvious implications about both her professional role and personal relationship with him. I studied Ashley, who stood nearby pretending not to listen, her expression a careful mask of professional neutrality. Ms. Wilson's future with Meridian will be evaluated like all executive staff, I replied neutrally. Performance, qualifications, and alignment with company values will determine appropriate roles. James nodded tersely and turned to leave, Ashley falling into step beside him with practiced synchronization. At the door, he paused for one final comment. The market won't respond well to acquisition termination. Be prepared for significant share price volatility and challenging questions from analysts. I'm more concerned with Meridian's long-term value creation than short-term market reactions, I replied, a perspective that seems to have been missing from recent leadership decisions. After they departed, Eleanor approached, satisfaction evident in her expression. Phase 1 complete, now the real work begins. Starting with damage assessment, I agreed. How deep does the rot go? Who remains committed to Meridian's principles, and who's been compromised? I've already started compiling dossiers on current executive staff, she confirmed. By tomorrow morning, You'll have preliminary assessments of where everyone stands." I squeezed her hand gratefully. "I couldn't have done this without you, Eleanor. Your loyalty to Grandpa's vision made all of this possible. Bill Bennett gave me opportunities no one else would have offered a female engineer in 1982, she replied simply. The least I could do was help his granddaughter reclaim his company when it needed her most. As the boardroom cleared, I took a moment alone at the head of the table, the position James had occupied for years and that my grandfather had held for decades before him. The responsibility was momentous, the challenges ahead formidable. But for the first time in years, Meridian Technologies had leadership committed to its founding purpose. My phone buzzed with a message from Sam. Security reports James and Ashley still in the building. Executive offices not packing up. Something's off. I texted back, "Meet me at the executive suite. Bring IT security." The executive floor was eerily quiet when I arrived with Sam and the IT security director. James's office door was closed, but lights visible underneath suggested continued occupancy. "Override the door lock," I instructed the IT specialist. The young woman nodded, using her security credentials to unlock the executive office. I pushed the door open without warning to find James and Ashley hurriedly gathering digital devices, while a third person, a man I recognized as Vertex's chief legal officer, collected documents from James's desk. All three froze at our entrance, caught in an act that couldn't possibly be interpreted positively. "What's going on here, James?" I asked, though the scene spoke for itself. "Post-vote administrative matters," he replied smoothly. "Richard Harmon requested immediate notification of contract termination requirements through his legal counsel, who appears to be removing company documents." I nodded toward the Vertex attorney, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. "All acquisition materials are Meridian property and subject to proper documentation protocols." The attorney carefully set down the papers. "I was merely reviewing notification requirements for force majeure provisions in the CEO's office without board knowledge, immediately following a vote that terminated the acquisition." Sam's tone made clear the implausibility of this explanation. I addressed the Vertex representative directly. "As Meridian's interim CEO, I'm instructing you to leave all documents in place and exit the building immediately. Any further communication regarding the terminated acquisition will occur through official channels between respective legal departments." The attorney recognized the compromise position and chose a strategic retreat. "Of course, my apologies for any procedural oversight." I turned to the IT specialist. "Please secure all electronic devices and documents in this office for forensic review. Nothing leaves without proper chain of custody documentation." "You can't just confiscate my personal devices," James objected. "This is overreach. Company-issued devices containing company information are subject to review following leadership transition," Sam countered. "Standard corporate protocol, as you well know." Ashley's composure finally cracked. "This is harassment. We were simply preparing transition materials as requested." "By removing documents with Vertex's counsel present?" I raised an eyebrow. "Let's not insult each other's intelligence, Ms. Wilson." As the IT specialist began documenting and securing devices, I addressed them both directly. "Effective immediately, your access to Meridian systems and facilities is suspended pending transition review. Security will escort you from the building once device surrender is complete." "You can't possibly run this company," James said quietly, his controlled facade finally slipping to reveal genuine anger. "You've been out of the industry for years. The technological landscape has transformed. You're fighting yesterday's battles with outdated weapons." "Perhaps," I acknowledged, "but I'm fighting for something that never becomes outdated. Integrity, quality, and treating people with respect. The very principles that built Meridian in the first place." Principles don't satisfy shareholders or fend off competitors, he countered. Strange. They did exactly that for the first 30 years of Meridian's existence. Perhaps the problem isn't with the principles, but with leadership that abandoned them for expedient gain. Security arrived to escort them out, a surreal reversal of fortune, as James and Ashley surrendered badges and devices before being led from the executive suite. Their expressions as they departed, James coldly furious, Ashley visibly shaken, suggested this confrontation was merely the opening salvo in a longer conflict. Once they were gone, Sam turned to me with a worried expression. We need to move quickly. If they were attempting to remove documents, there's likely digital evidence at risk as well. The next 12 hours passed in a blur of activity as we implemented emergency protocols to protect Meridian's intellectual property, client relationships, and operational continuity. By midnight, we had established basic security controls and began assessing the true state of the company James was leaving behind. The picture that emerged was troubling. Innovations delayed to make the company more attractive for acquisition, employee morale at historic lows, quality control measures systematically weakened to improve short-term margins. As I finally prepared to leave what had been the longest day of my professional life, I noticed a small frame on the credenza behind the desk, a photograph I hadn't seen in years. Grandpa and me standing before Meridian's original building, his arm around my shoulders as we both smiled at the camera. I had no idea how the picture had found its way to this office, but its presence felt like a silent affirmation of the path forward. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.